The bus stop sat at the edge of an unlit stretch of road where the faint yellow glow of a dying street lamp was the only interruption to the suffocating darkness. It was a place that seemed forgotten by time, nestled between a dense thicket of trees and the crumbling facade of a long-abandoned gas station. No one ever waited there unless they absolutely had to. But on this frigid October night, the necessity outweighed the unease. Emma stood under the flickering street lamp, her breath visible in the icy air. Her car had broken down miles back, and her phone, in a cruel twist of fate, had died hours earlier. The bus schedule, barely legible on the rusted sign, promised a ride at 10:15 p.m. It was now 10:07. She tapped her fingers against her coat, trying to ignore the unsettling silence and the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. The night had a strange weight to it, as if the darkness pressed closer than usual. She glanced at the thicket of trees. They loomed, their twisted branches resembling skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. A faint rustle made her snap her head toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the wind, she told herself. Then came the laughter. It was soft at first, like the faint chuckle of someone overhearing a private joke. Emma froze. It wasn't the kind of laughter that brought joy. It was the kind that tightened your chest and sent shivers up your spine. It was too close. She spun around, searching for the source, but the bus stop and the surrounding road remained empty. The laughter swelled, mingling with the wind until it was everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if snuffed out by her words. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the street lamp above her flickered violently before plunging her into complete darkness. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she fumbled in her bag for anything that could serve as a light. She found an old, nearly drained flashlight and flicked it on. The weak beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the bus stop sign and the road beyond. It was empty. But when she turned the flashlight toward the trees, her breath caught. A figure stood among the shadows, motionless, watching her. It was hard to make out any details, but its shape was unmistakably human. Emma's pulse quickened as she pointed the beam directly at it. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to breathe. It simply stood there, a silhouette darker than the night itself. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to mask the fear in her voice. No answer. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt unnervingly predatory. Emma took a step back, nearly tripping over the curb. The figure mirrored her movement, stepping forward into the light. What emerged from the shadows was worse than anything Emma could have imagined. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface that seemed to absorb the light. Its body was emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and crooked, as if it had been assembled by someone who didn't fully understand human anatomy. Emma turned and ran, her boots pounding against the asphalt. She didn't care where she was going, only that it was away from that thing. She glanced over her shoulder and saw it lurching after her, its movements jerky and wrong, as though it were mimicking the act of running without truly understanding it. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle filled her with a surge of hope. The bus! She sprinted toward the headlights, waving her arms frantically. The bus slowed, its brakes screeching as it pulled up beside her. Emma didn't wait for the door to fully open before scrambling inside. "Please drive! Drive now!" she yelled, her voice frantic. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, looked at her quizzically, but didn't argue. The doors hissed shut, and the bus pulled away from the stop. Emma collapsed into a seat, her chest heaving. She looked out the window, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching as she escaped. But the road was empty. "You okay, miss?" the driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. I think so," she managed, though her hands were still shaking. She didn't dare explain what she had seen, fearing he wouldn't believe her, or worse, that he would stop the bus. The ride was uneventful for several miles, and Emma began to convince herself that she was safe. Maybe her mind had played tricks on her. Maybe the stress of the night had conjured up something that wasn't really there. But as the bus entered another dark stretch of road, her heart sank. The interior lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. The driver cursed under his breath, pulling the bus to a stop. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Damn thing's acting up again," the driver grumbled. Shouldn't take long. He stepped off the bus to inspect the engine, leaving Emma alone. The flickering lights cast unsettling shadows across the empty seats. She stared out the window, her breath catching when she saw it. The figure was back. Standing in the middle of the road, it was closer than before, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. Emma scrambled toward the driver's seat, frantically honking the horn to get his attention. The lights inside the bus went out completely, plunging her into darkness once more. The doors hissed open, and something stepped inside.
Story number 2.
There was a bus stop just outside of town, sitting lonely at the fork where two roads met. During the day, it was nothing remarkable. A weathered bench under a cracked plastic awning. At night, however, it seemed to transform. People whispered about it, about the things that happened there after dark. A rumor circulated among locals, no matter what, never catch the 11:45 p.m. bus from that stop. Some said the passengers weren't alive. Others claimed the bus wasn't either. It was a bitter winter evening when Mark, desperate and tired, ignored the warnings. His phone battery was dead, and walking home was out of the question in the biting cold. He arrived at the bus stop at 11:30, his breath a foggy mist in the air. The town was silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches or the distant hoot of an owl. The bench felt colder than ice as he sat. The street lamp above flickered, casting uneven light that only heightened the oppressive emptiness around him. He checked his watch, 11:43. He would be home soon, he told himself. Just a few more minutes. Then the sound came. It started faint, almost imperceptible, a low hum like an engine running in the distance. Mark stood, peering down the road. The sound grew louder, and soon the headlights appeared, cutting through the dense fog that had inexplicably rolled in. The bus emerged from the mist, its frame old and rusted, its windows so dark they reflected nothing back. It screeched to a halt in front of him. The doors groaned open, and a wave of freezing air rushed out. Mark hesitated, an unexplainable dread pooling in his stomach. But the cold outside was unbearable, and he told himself it was just a bus. He climbed aboard. The driver didn't look at him. In fact, the driver didn't seem to move at all, his face hidden beneath a brimmed hat. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale and unmoving. Mark glanced around. The bus was nearly full, but something felt off. The passengers were silent, sitting rigidly in their seats, their faces obscured by hoods or shadows. Mark paid his fare and sat near the middle, gripping the cold metal pole in front of him. The bus jolted forward, the engine groaning like a dying beast. As they drove, Mark realized the route didn't seem familiar. The roads were narrower, the trees denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the bus like skeletal hands. "Excuse me," Mark said, standing and turning toward the driver. "I think you missed my stop." No response. He looked back at the passengers, hoping one of them would reassure him, but they didn't move. Their stillness was unnerving, their heads bowed like mourners at a funeral. A chill ran down Mark's spine when he noticed something strange. Their breath didn't fog in the cold air. "Hey, driver!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cramped space. He moved toward the front, but the driver remained as still as stone. The bus lurched suddenly, and Mark stumbled, grabbing a seat for balance. That's when he saw it. The passengers' hands. They weren't normal hands. They were gray, mottled with decay, the fingers too long, the nails sharp and blackened. Mark staggered back, his heart pounding. As if sensing his fear, the passengers began to stir. Heads lifted, revealing faces that were wrong. Empty eye sockets, mouths that stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Mark ran to the back of the bus, slamming his fists against the rear door. "Stop the bus! Let me out!" he screamed. The figures began to rise, their movements jerky, unnatural, as though their bones were bending the wrong way. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. The driver finally turned his head. His face was hollow, a black abyss where features should have been. A voice, guttural and inhuman, echoed through the bus. "You shouldn't have gotten on." The lights inside the bus flickered violently, and Mark felt the floor beneath him shift. He looked down and realized the bus wasn't on a road anymore. It was speeding through a vast, black void, the windows now showing nothing but swirling darkness. The passengers closed in, their twisted faces contorting in anticipation. Mark screamed as their cold-clawed hands reached for him, pulling him into their midst. The bus disappeared. The next morning, the bus stop was empty. Mark's body was never found, but locals swore they heard faint screams echoing through the fog that night. Weeks later, someone noticed a new passenger on the 11:45 p.m. bus. A man sitting rigidly in the middle, his head bowed, his breath no longer fogging in the cold air.
Story number 3.
No one ever stayed long at the Willow Creek bus stop. It wasn't just the eerie isolation of its location. A crumbling shelter perched at the edge of a forgotten dirt road surrounded by thick, silent woods. It was the stories. The townspeople warned newcomers, if you saw the bus arrive before you heard it, don't get on. Mia had heard the warnings before. She didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. She was practical, grounded in reality. But on this particular night, stranded after her shift at the diner, reality felt a little less certain. Her car wouldn't start, and the next bus was her only option. The moon was a faint sliver in the overcast sky as Mia walked to the stop, her footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground. She pulled her coat tighter, trying to ignore the oppressive stillness. Even the crickets seemed afraid to make a sound. When she reached the shelter, the wooden bench inside was damp and splintered, but she sat anyway. Her phone had no signal, and the silence gnawed at her nerves. The bus was due at 12:15 a.m. She glanced at her watch. 12:07. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees like distant voices. Mia tapped her foot impatiently, her breath visible in the cold air. Then she noticed something odd. The wind had stopped, but the whispers hadn't. She scanned the woods, her heart racing. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer, only the faint murmurs growing louder. And then she saw it. Headlights piercing through the trees. The bus emerged without a sound. No engine hum, no screech of brakes, just an unnatural silence as it pulled up to the stop. Mia's stomach churned. She remembered the warning, if you saw it before you heard it, don't get on. But what choice did she have? She was alone, miles from home, and the chill was biting through her coat. The doors hissed open and a figure stepped down. The driver was tall and gaunt, his uniform ill-fitting as though it belonged to someone else. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed to reflect the darkness around him. "Need a ride?" His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. Mia hesitated but nodded, climbing aboard. The interior of the bus was dim, the overhead lights flickering weakly. She chose a seat near the front, clutching her bag tightly. The bus jerked forward, and Mia noticed there were no other passengers. The driver didn't speak. He didn't even look at her again. The silence pressed against her like a weight. She tried to focus on the world outside, but the windows revealed nothing but darkness. The road seemed endless. Minutes passed, then hours, and the scenery never changed. Mia glanced at her watch. It was 1:43 a.m. How could it still be 1:43? She had been on the bus for what felt like an eternity. "Excuse me," she called to the driver. "When are we stopping?" No response. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale as bone. "Hey," I said. The driver turned his head sharply, and Mia's voice died in her throat. His face was wrong. His eyes were empty sockets, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing jagged yellow teeth. "We'll stop when it's time," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. The lights on the bus flickered violently, and Mia felt the temperature plummet. She turned to the windows, desperate for something familiar, but the darkness outside had changed. Shapes moved within it, twisting, writhing, clawing at the glass. She could hear them now, whispers turning into guttural growls. Panicked, Mia bolted to the back of the bus. She pounded on the emergency door, but it wouldn't budge. The other windows revealed the same nightmare, shadows with glowing eyes and crooked limbs pressing closer. The bus slowed. Mia turned back toward the driver, who was staring at her now, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. "This is your stop," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The doors opened, revealing a swirling void of blackness. Wind howled through the bus, pulling at her with invisible hands. Mia screamed, grabbing onto a pole to resist the pull. "No! Let me off somewhere else, anywhere else!" The driver tilted his head as if amused. "There's nowhere else to go." The shadows from outside poured in, filling the bus with cold and darkness. They wrapped around Mia, dragging her toward the open doors. She clawed at the floor, at the seats, at anything she could hold on to, but it was useless. Her screams faded as she disappeared into the void. The bus continued down the empty road, its headlights cutting through the dark. The next morning, the Willow Creek bus stop was empty again, save for a lone bag sitting on the bench, a bag that looked eerily familiar to anyone who might have known Mia.
Story number 4.
The last train to Ravenhill wasn't supposed to stop at the old Ridgeway bus terminal. It hadn't for years. The terminal had been closed after a fire gutted half the building, leaving its skeletal remains to rot on the edge of the city. But on a rainy November night, Danny found himself there, waiting for a bus that shouldn't have been running. His shift at the factory had gone late, and his usual ride home had bailed on him. Desperation brought him to Ridgeway. He'd heard whispers about the place from his coworkers, stories of strange sightings of people who boarded buses there and were never seen again. Danny dismissed them as drunken gossip. Tonight, though, he couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. The shelter was little more than a rusted metal frame with cracked glass panes. Rainwater pooled in the corners, and the faint stench of mildew hung in the air. Danny checked his watch, 11:57 p.m. The schedule taped to the wall claimed the next bus would arrive at midnight. He didn't see how that was possible. The road leading to the terminal was overgrown, and no one in their right mind would drive here. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the ruined terminal. In the burst of light, Danny thought he saw movement, a figure darting between the remnants of the old waiting area. He squinted into the darkness, but the rain obscured everything. Probably just an animal, he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the hairs on the back of his neck refused to lie flat. At precisely midnight, the sound of an engine rumbled through the night. Danny stood, his heart pounding. Headlights pierced through the rain, and an old bus, its paint peeling and its windows fogged, pulled into the terminal. Its brakes squealed, and the doors creaked open. Danny hesitated. Something about the bus felt off. The light inside was dim and flickered like a dying bulb. But what choice did he have? The next bus wouldn't come for hours, if it came at all. He stepped aboard. The driver was an older man, his face shadowed beneath a peaked cap. His uniform was outdated, the fabric fraying at the edges. He didn't greet Danny, the heck didn't even glance at him. Danny slid his fare into the box and moved to the back. The interior was eerily quiet. Only a handful of passengers sat scattered throughout, each one hunched over as if lost in thought. Danny avoided eye contact, choosing a seat near the rear. As the bus pulled away, he noticed something strange. None of the passengers seemed wet, despite the downpour outside. Their clothes were pristine, their hair perfectly dry. The bus lurched forward, and Danny clung to the pole in front of him. The windows were foggy, making it impossible to see where they were going. He tried to relax, but the silence was suffocating. The other passengers didn't talk, didn't move, didn't even breathe, as far as he could tell. Time passed, though Danny couldn't say how much. He checked his phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. His watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 12:10. He looked out the window, but the landscape was unfamiliar. They weren't on city streets anymore. The road was narrow, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in with every passing second. "Excuse me," Danny called to the driver, his voice shaky. "Where are we going?" The driver didn't respond. Danny stood and walked to the front of the bus, gripping the seats for balance as the vehicle jolted over potholes. "Hey, I need to get to Elm Street." "Is this the right bus?" The driver turned slowly, and Danny's stomach dropped. The man's face was wrong, distorted like a poorly made mask. His eyes were hollow sockets, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with crooked, yellowed teeth. "You're already on the way," the driver rasped, his voice a guttural whisper. Danny stumbled back, heart pounding. The passengers began to stir, their heads lifting in unison. Their faces were the same as the driver's, empty eyes, grotesque grins, and a sickly pallor that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The bus jerked to a stop. The doors hissed open, revealing a swirling void of darkness outside. The wind howled, carrying faint whispers that sounded like cries for help. "End of the line," the driver said, his grin widening. The passengers stood, moving toward Danny with unnatural, jerky movements. "No, no, no," Danny yelled, backing into the rear of the bus. He pounded on the emergency exit, but it wouldn't budge. The passengers were closer now, their hands outstretched, fingers elongating into sharp, bony claws. Danny turned to face the door and jumped. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto the wet pavement. The wind whipped around him as he scrambled to his feet. When he looked back, the bus was gone. No headlights, no taillights, just an empty road stretching into the darkness. He ran until his lungs burned, until the rain soaked him to the bone, until he found a gas station on the edge of town. The attendant stared at him as he stumbled inside, shaking and drenched. "What happened to you?" the man asked, handing Danny a towel. Danny didn't answer. He couldn't. The last thing he saw before he escaped replayed in his mind. The passengers, their faces pressed against the bus windows, grinning as the vehicle vanished into the night.
Story number 5.
They called it the Shadow Route, though no one could say for certain where the name came from. It wasn't listed on any transit map, and the buses that ran it were never seen during the day. But if you found yourself stranded in the city after midnight, desperate for a way home, you might spot it. A bus with no number, no destination, and a strange, dim glow around its headlights. Lisa first heard about the Shadow Route from her roommate Sarah, who swore she'd seen it once. "Don't get on it," Sarah had warned. "It doesn't take you where you want to go." Lisa had laughed it off, chalking it up to one of Sarah's drunken stories. But now, standing at an empty bus stop in the pouring rain, Lisa wished she'd paid more attention. Her phone was dead. Her umbrella had snapped in the wind, and she was too far from home to walk. The streets were eerily quiet, the city's usual bustle swallowed by the storm. She glanced at her watch, 12:34 a.m. She was about to give up and start walking when she saw the headlights approaching. Her relief was short-lived as the bus emerged from the fog. It looked old, ancient even. Its paint was peeling and its windows were covered in grime. There was no route number on the display, just a faint glow that seemed to pulse unnaturally. The bus stopped in front of her with a low hiss. The doors creaked open, revealing a driver who looked strange. His uniform was outdated and his skin had a pale, waxy quality, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to get on. Lisa hesitated, her roommate's words echoing in her mind. But the rain was relentless, and she couldn't bear the thought of walking miles in it. She stepped onto the bus, dropped a few coins into the fare box, and took a seat near the middle. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows. The air was thick and stale, with a faint metallic smell she couldn't place. A few other passengers sat scattered throughout, but they didn't acknowledge her. They stared straight ahead, their faces obscured by the shadows. The bus jerked forward, and Lisa clutched the edge of her seat. The ride was rough, the vehicle shuddering as it navigated roads that seemed bumpier than they should have been. She glanced out the window, but couldn't make out anything beyond the glass. It was as though the city had disappeared, replaced by an endless void. Her unease grew as she noticed something odd about the other passengers. They didn't move, not even to shift in their seats. Their breathing was imperceptible, their stillness unnerving. One of them, a woman in a long coat, had her head tilted slightly, as though she were listening to something. Lisa strained her ears but heard only the bus's rattling engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers. Then the whispers started. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a faint murmuring that seemed to come from nowhere. But as the bus continued, the whispers grew louder, filling the space like a distant chant. Lisa turned to the man sitting across the aisle. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. She leaned closer, hoping to catch his attention, and froze. His face wasn't right. His eyes were sunken, his skin unnaturally pale, and his mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. She gasped and jerked back, her heart pounding. The man turned his head slowly toward her, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his hollow eyes. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said, his voice a guttural rasp. Lisa bolted from her seat, stumbling toward the front of the bus. "Stop! Let me off!" she shouted at the driver. He didn't react. His hands remained firmly on the wheel, his face expressionless. The bus sped up, the engine roaring as it hurtled into the darkness. The whispers became a cacophony, voices overlapping in an incomprehensible chant. Lisa grabbed at the emergency door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, screaming for help. Behind her, the passengers began to rise, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their faces were no longer human, twisted into grotesque masks of gaping mouths and empty eyes. They shuffled toward her, their feet dragging on the floor. "No, stay away!" Lisa screamed, backing into the corner. The air grew colder, the shadows darker as the figures closed in. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the driver turning to look at her. His face was hollow, his eyes filled with nothing but darkness. "This is the end of the line," he said. The bus disappeared into the void, leaving no trace behind. The next morning, a lone umbrella was found at the bus stop. No one knew where it had come from or who it belonged to. But the townspeople added another warning to the Shadow Route's legend. If you see the bus on a stormy night, don't get on, because once you do, you'll never get off.
Story number 6.
It was a little after 1 a.m. when Mark stumbled upon the stop. He'd been walking aimlessly through unfamiliar streets, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had clung to him since leaving his friend's party. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel louder, sharper. The bus stop looked ancient. The paint on the metal frame was chipped, the glass shelter fogged and streaked with grime. A single flickering light overhead cast long, distorted shadows. Mark didn't remember seeing it earlier, but he wasn't about to question his luck. He was tired, cold, and just wanted to get home. He checked the schedule posted inside the shelter. The timetable was faded, but he could make out the next arrival, 1:13 a.m. Perfect. He slumped onto the bench, rubbing his hands together to ward off the chill. Minutes passed. The street remained empty, and the light continued its uneven flicker. Mark glanced at his watch, 1:12. Just one more minute. Then he heard it, the low growl of an engine, the hiss of tires on wet pavement. He looked up, expecting to see headlights in the distance, but the sound seemed to come from nowhere. The bus appeared as if out of thin air. One moment the street was empty, and the next it was there, its bulk looming under the weak light. The vehicle was old, its exterior marred with scratches and dents. The route number displayed above the windshield was illegible, the digits warped and flickering. The doors opened with a groan, and a wave of cold air rushed out. Mark hesitated, the unease that had followed him all night growing stronger. But where else could he go? He stepped aboard, dropping a crumpled bill into the fare box. The driver didn't greet him. He was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for his face. His uniform was crisp but outdated, like something from decades ago. Without a word, the driver gestured for Mark to take a seat. The interior of the bus was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs casting a sickly yellow glow. A handful of passengers sat scattered throughout, their faces obscured by shadows. Mark chose a seat near the middle, avoiding eye contact. The bus jerked forward, and Mark braced himself against the seat in front of him. He glanced out the window, but the streets were unrecognizable. Buildings passed by in a blur, their shapes warped and unnatural. Something felt wrong. The bus was moving too fast, yet the scenery outside seemed to crawl. The other passengers didn't move or speak. They sat perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly downward as if asleep, or worse. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Hey," he said to the man sitting across the aisle. "Do you know where this bus is going?" The man didn't respond. His head lifted slightly, and Mark caught a glimpse of his face. He recoiled. The man's skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His mouth was open just enough to reveal teeth that were sharp and uneven, more like an animal's than a human's. Mark turned away, his heart pounding. He needed to get off. Now. He stood and made his way toward the front, gripping the seatbacks to steady himself. "Excuse me," he said to the driver. "I need to get off at the next stop." The driver didn't reply. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles bone white. "Did you hear me?" Mark's voice was louder now, edged with panic. The driver turned his head slowly, too slowly, and Mark froze. The man's face was stretched, his features distorted. His eyes were empty sockets, and his grin was impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You can't leave," the driver rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Mark stumbled back, his heart hammering. The bus lights flickered wildly, plunging the interior into darkness for brief, terrifying moments. The other passengers began to move, their heads snapping toward him in unison. Their faces were all wrong. Too pale, too twisted, too dead. The bus shuddered violently, and Mark was thrown to the floor. The windows showed nothing but blackness now, an endless void that seemed to pulse and breathe. The passengers stood, their movements jerky and unnatural. They reached for him, their hands bony and claw-like. Mark crawled toward the back of the bus, his mind racing. He had to find a way out. His fingers found the emergency exit, and he clawed at it desperately. The handle wouldn't budge. The passengers were closer now, their whispers filling the air. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was malevolent, filled with hunger. With a final desperate scream, Mark kicked the door with all his strength. It flew open, and he tumbled out into the night. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto wet pavement. When he looked up, the bus was gone. The street was empty, silent. Mark staggered to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was back in the city, but nothing looked familiar. The buildings were twisted, their windows dark. The air felt heavy, oppressive. A figure emerged from the shadows, a gaunt man in a crisp, outdated uniform. He smiled, revealing jagged teeth. "The ride's not over yet," the driver said, his voice echoing in the empty street.
Story number 7.
The road leading to Briarwood was quiet at night, a winding stretch of asphalt surrounded by dense forest. Locals avoided it after dark, but for Amanda, it was a shortcut home. She told herself it was just a road. Trees and shadows couldn't hurt her. Tonight, though, something felt different. Her car hummed steadily as she drove, the headlights cutting through the inky blackness. The radio played softly, but she kept glancing at the rearview mirror. She felt like she was being watched, though she knew that was impossible. She was alone. The feeling grew stronger as she approached an old bus stop near the halfway point of Briarwood. It was a relic of a bygone era, a wooden shelter sagging under the weight of time. No one used it anymore. There hadn't been bus service on this road for decades. As Amanda passed, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Her foot instinctively eased off the gas. A figure stood at the bus stop, barely visible in the faint glow of her taillights. "Who the hell would be out here at this hour?" she muttered, slowing the car. Her better judgment told her to keep driving, but curiosity got the better of her. She pulled over a few feet ahead of the stop and glanced in her side mirror. The figure was still there, standing unnaturally still. Amanda rolled down her window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move. Amanda squinted, trying to get a better look. It appeared to be a woman in a long coat, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her posture was strange, rigid, as though she were frozen in place. "Do you need a ride?" Amanda called, her voice tinged with hesitation. The woman turned slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her face came into view, and Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The woman's features were pale and gaunt, her eyes too large and glinting unnaturally in the darkness. Her mouth twisted into a smile that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white. Amanda slammed the window shut and hit the gas. Her car lurched forward, tires squealing as she sped away. She gripped the wheel tightly, her heart racing. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, but the bus stop was empty. The woman was gone. Her pulse began to steady as she put distance between herself and the stop. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, though she didn't believe it. A few minutes later, the feeling returned, that suffocating sense of being watched. She glanced at the passenger seat and screamed. The woman was sitting beside her. Her coat was damp, her hat casting a shadow over her face. Slowly, she turned to Amanda, that grotesque smile widening. "You didn't ask where I was going," the woman said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. Amanda slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. She flung the door open and scrambled out, stumbling onto the road. When she looked back, the car was empty. The passenger seat was vacant, the doors locked. Amanda's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away. Her car engine sputtered, the headlights flickering. Then the vehicle roared to life and sped off, disappearing into the darkness. She stood there, trembling, with no choice but to walk. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and the forest pressed in around her. Then she heard it, the faint growl of an engine, the screech of brakes. A bus emerged from the shadows, its headlights dim and flickering. It stopped in front of her with a low hiss, the doors creaking open. The driver leaned out, his face pale and waxy, his grin unnaturally wide. "End of the line," he said.
Story number 8.
It was one of those nights that seemed unnaturally quiet. No breeze, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive stillness that made the air feel heavy. Mia had missed her usual bus home and was stuck waiting at a stop she'd never used before. The sign above it read Pine Hollow Route, but she didn't recall seeing it on the city's map. The bus stop itself was peculiar. Weathered wooden planks formed the bench, and the glass enclosure was etched with strange symbols, almost like scratches from an animal. A single dim streetlight flickered above, casting uneven shadows. Mia glanced at her phone. It was 11:47 p.m., and the next bus wasn't due for another 13 minutes. The battery icon blinked red. She hated waiting in places like this. The longer she stood there, the more the shadows seemed to shift around her. She kept checking the road, hoping to see headlights, but the street remained empty. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the occasional rustle from the woods nearby. Then, faintly at first, she heard it. A low rumble of an engine. Relieved, she stepped closer to the curb, expecting to see the familiar outline of the city bus. But as the vehicle came into view, her stomach twisted. It wasn't a regular bus. The thing that rolled toward her looked ancient, its frame dented and rusted, with shattered windows patched over with blackened tape. The headlights glowed faintly red, like embers, and then a number above the windshield blinked erratically, alternating between shh and a blank screen. The bus came to a screeching halt, its doors hissing open. The driver was shrouded in darkness, his face barely visible. What Mia could see didn't look right. His eyes glinted unnaturally, and his hands gripping the wheel were long and skeletal. "Late night, huh?" he said, his voice raspy and low. Mia hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to walk away. But the woods behind her felt just as unwelcoming, and the thought of walking miles home in the dark was unbearable. Against her better judgment, she climbed aboard. The interior was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering sporadically. The seats were torn, stuffing spilling out, and a faint, acrid smell hung in the air. A handful of passengers were scattered throughout, but none looked up as Mia walked past. Their heads were bowed, their faces hidden beneath hoods or shadows. She sat near the back, gripping her bag tightly. The bus lurched forward with a violent jolt, and Mia braced herself against the seat in front of her. The ride felt wrong from the start. The bus moved too quickly, taking sharp turns that sent Mia sliding across the seat. She tried to look out the window, but the view was a blur of twisted trees and darkness, as if the bus wasn't traveling through the city at all. The other passengers didn't move. They sat unnaturally still, their heads tilting occasionally, as though listening to something Mia couldn't hear. Then came the whispers. They started soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, more distinct, a cacophony of overlapping voices. Mia turned to the man sitting across from her. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Slowly, his head turned toward her, and Mia's breath caught in her throat. His face was wrong. His eyes were pitch black, his mouth stretched wide in a grin that revealed sharp, jagged teeth. His skin was cracked, flaking off in chunks to reveal something dark and pulsating beneath. "Why did you get on?" he asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. Mia scrambled to her feet, stumbling toward the front of the bus. The whispers grew deafening, filling her head with words she couldn't understand but instinctively feared. She reached the driver, gripping the pole beside him. "Stop the bus! Let me off!" The driver turned slowly, his face now fully visible. His features were grotesque, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to suck in the dim light. "There's no getting off," he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. The bus shuddered violently, and the lights went out completely. Mia clung to the pole as the whispers reached a fever pitch, drowning out her screams. When the lights flickered back on, the bus was empty. The passengers were gone, the driver's seat vacant. Mia was alone. The bus rolled to a stop, its doors creaking open. Outside was a vast expanse of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of distant, flickering lights. Shapes moved in the shadows, tall, thin figures with glowing eyes that watched her hungrily. Mia backed away, but the bus doors slammed shut behind her. A voice echoed through the silence, deep and resonant. "Welcome to the end of the line." The lights on the bus flickered once more before plunging into darkness. Mia's scream was swallowed by the night.
Story number 9.
Megan always worked late. She liked the quiet of her office when everyone else had gone home, but tonight felt different. Her usual bus stop, tucked away on the outskirts of downtown, felt wrong somehow. The air was colder, the silence heavier, and even the streetlights seemed dimmer. She glanced at her phone, 1:27 a.m. The bus was due any minute. She shifted nervously on the bench, clutching her bag tightly. The city felt deserted. and the shadows seemed darker than usual. When the bus finally appeared, it came from the wrong direction. Megan frowned as the vehicle rolled up, its headlights dull and yellow. The route number above the windshield was blank. She hesitated, but exhaustion won out. She stepped aboard. The driver didn't acknowledge her, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He nodded slightly as she dropped her fare into the box. "Late night," he muttered, his voice gravelly. Megan nodded back but said nothing. The bus smelled odd, a mixture of mildew and something metallic. She moved to the middle and sat down, glancing around at the other passengers. They didn't seem quite right. A man in a suit sat across from her, but his head hung low, his chin nearly touching his chest. A woman further back cradled something in her arms, rocking gently. Megan couldn't tell what it was. Her body blocked most of it, but she noticed the woman's hands. They were long and thin, the fingers unnaturally sharp. She looked away, pretending to scroll through her phone, but the unease grew with every second. The bus moved slowly, the engine groaning as it crawled down unfamiliar streets. Megan peered out the window, but nothing looked familiar. The buildings were tall and narrow, their windows dark and empty. The sidewalks were cracked, weeds sprouting through the gaps. The bus turned a corner and Megan's stomach dropped. The same buildings passed by again. She was sure of it. "Excuse me," she called out to the driver, her voice trembling slightly. "Are we going in circles?" The driver didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Megan's pulse quickened. She turned to the man in the suit. "Do you know where this bus is going?" The man's head snapped up. His face was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His mouth opened as if to answer, but no words came out, just a long, low groan. Megan recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The woman at the back began humming softly, rocking faster. Megan bolted from her seat and ran toward the driver. "Stop the bus! Let me off!" The driver's head turned, impossibly slowly, until his face came into view. His skin was waxy and translucent, his eyes sunken into dark sockets. A twisted smile spread across his lips, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "There's no stopping now," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The bus shuddered and the lights flickered. Megan stumbled, clutching the railing to steady herself. The hum of the woman at the back turned into a low, guttural growl. She turned, her heart racing, and saw the passengers standing now. Their movements were stiff, jerky, as if their joints didn't quite work. Their faces were distorted, their mouths too wide, their eyes empty pits. The woman held out what she'd been cradling, a bundle wrapped in cloth. The fabric unraveled, revealing a withered, shriveled thing that twitched and blinked. Megan screamed, running to the rear door. She banged on the emergency exit, but it wouldn't budge. The passengers advanced, their mouths opening wide, emitting a chorus of whispers that grew louder and louder. "You shouldn't have gotten on," they hissed in unison. The bus lights went out completely. Megan's screams were drowned out by the deafening roar of the engine and the cacophony of whispers. When she opened her eyes, she was standing alone at the bus stop. Her bag was on the ground, her phone lying beside it, its screen shattered. The street was empty, silent, as though nothing had happened. But something had. As Megan turned to leave, her eyes caught the faint outline of a bus in the distance. It stood idle, its doors open, waiting.